Chapter 20 of 100 Years of Modernism by Father Bourmaud. Chapter 20. Assessment of Neomodernism. It is important to assess the damages at the end of our study of neomodernism in order to gain an overview, as we did for Protestant and Catholic modernism respectively. A rapid sketch of the principal authors will cast into relief their common fundamental principles. Seeing where they stand will give us the perspective to judge how far they have advanced beyond their modernist predecessors and to determine whether this new school of thought constitutes a simple evolution in Catholicism or a revolution of ideas. We will conclude by comparing the action taken by Pius XII with that of St. Pius X. 1. An overview of the authors. Our four representatives of neo-modernists form a motley crew: a famous paleontologist from the 30s, an atheist German existentialist philosopher, a discreet French scholar, topped off with an abstruse post-war theologian. Teilhard de Chardin's life and teaching are entirely bound up with his doctrine of evolution. His theology could be defined quite simply as the marriage of biology and Hegelian evolution. Picking up where Darwin left off, he developed the scientific theory of vital evolution, according to which matter evolves progressively toward life, then toward human life, until it finally attains the omega point. This culmination of evolution will be an apotheosis, the ultimate moment in time when men will be saved by the coming of the Superman, personification of divinized humanity, the universal Christ toward whom the Church is ever advancing. Behold the syncretist religion satisfying to all beliefs. Draped in a scientific hypothesis, namely natural evolution, Teilhard de Chardin strolled confidently into the domain of theology and began redefining the sacred terms of grace, supernature, original sin, incarnation, redemption, and the sacraments according to the categories of evolution. In so doing, he resurrected the doctrines most dear to the 18th century: deists, self-creation, self-salvation, and the union of all men in a New Jerusalem. Heidegger represents the philosophy born between the two world wars, existentialism, which was to play so predominant a role in all of neo-modernist thought. It is defined as the descriptive philosophy of personal 100 years of modernism and free human existence. In contrast with the exaggerated optimism of the Kantian idealists, existentialism underlines the absurdity of things and of the world. It exalts the liberated human consciousness, moved by pure caprice to launch forward upon a path to nowhere. The first principle of existentialism, I think it is, betrays the same mixture of voluntarism and introspective knowledge which we have already met in studying Bergson. Existentialism is defined above all as the egological philosophy of the consciousness. All that exists is and has meaning only in virtue of the thinking self. What is more, things have no nature, since the second existentialist principle states that existence precedes essence. In this way, the primary human faculty is not reason, but the most absurd liberty. Man's ultimate good is not truth, but creative liberty. The third principle defines that the present moment is creative, which reflects the Bergsonian theory that being is duration and pure becoming. It is a return to Bergson's creative evolution, by which all things come from man. De Lubac, in Exegesis, follows Bultmann's form history, which is essentially a resurrection of Strauss's pure critique. However, de Lubac's tone is always one of moderation. His exegetical labor is aimed at overcoming the opposition between dogmatism and the historico-critical method, which had mutually excommunicated each other. His originality comes from the following few points. He emphasized in Exegesis the authority of the Fathers of the Church, but at the same time neglected the traditional magisterium and scholastic theology. He revived spiritual and patristic exegesis, but oriented them toward historical symbolism, faithful to the modern principles of critique. Thus he claimed that the Fathers of the Church sought in exegesis the full meaning of Scripture, which is open to two incompatible interpretations, one historical and the other a denial of history. He also invented the notion of living tradition, expressing the theory of a pluralistic revelation, indefinitely extending to successive and enriching readings. In short, De Lubac represents a return to the sources of exegesis, profitable in many ways but with the disadvantage of giving precedence to history and critique over dogma. Notice that the same inversion and imbalance were present in Loisy and ultimately led him astray. As for Rahner, the German owed his philosophy primarily to Hegel with some dipping into Heidegger. He adopted Hegel's dialectical method, which sees all things as evolving out of the great whole, passing by the cosmos and returning again to the great whole. Such a method, which unites contraries only to go beyond them, ends in pure contradiction. The Hegelian absolute is the infinite, but it is also the finite, such that the infinite becomes the finite and the finite steps beyond its boundaries to become the infinite absolute. What is more, Rahner reduced being to being known and even confounded it with the will. In so doing, he was espousing assessment of neomodernism, the fundamental egological principle, cogito volo. I will, I think it is. In the last analysis, Rahner's theology is simply Catholic theology transposed into the key of Hegel. Catholicism is transformed into a vast movement, a tightly linking chain leading from the Trinity to Christ, and from Christ to man and the cosmos before the final return to God. This chain makes of man the center of theology, which is why Rahner christened it the anthropological inversion. Its movement comprises three principal phases: the Trinitarian phase, descending Christology, and ascending Christology. Just as God needs history in order to become triune, just as the Word can only be Word if He is Word incarnate, so also God needs the world in order to be God. The infinite ought to exteriorize and step out of itself by casting itself into the finite in order to emerge at last as conscious infinitude, according to Hegel's evolutionary pattern as revised by Teilhard de Chardin. Rahner's system possesses the same tight internal logic as Hegel's, linking without a hitch matter, spirit capacity of human nature, supernature, natural desire for the incarnation. Rahner's theology blurs the distinction between the natural and the supernatural orders, setting off a series of consequences: natural revelation, the pluralism of creeds, universal salvation, anonymous Christians, an empty hell, the bursting of the Roman ghetto church, and unlimited ecumenism. 2. The identity of fundamental principles. After viewing the rogues gallery of neomodernism, we can definitely speak of a family resemblance with previous eras. The generations go by. The culture and the individuals are no longer the same, but the principles are immutable. There certainly is nothing new under the modernist sun. The same anti-philosophical principles of ignorantism, egology, and revolutionism remain fixed points on the horizon. The existentialists are ignorantist by their denial of essences to the benefit of an empty existence, the existence which precedes essence. They are ignorantist also when they reduce knowledge to appearances and images to be is to appear, which is a pure and simple denial that things in themselves can be known. Biblical criticism follows Bultmann's form history, which denies that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts of historical facts. It would have us believe that the evangelists did not know the eighth commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," because its primary tenet is basically that the Gospels are not gospel truth since they are riddled with errors. Spiritual exegesis also favors ignorantism because it admits of equivocacy in terms and their polyvalent interpretation. As for Rahner's theology, suffice it to say that his sources are the contradictory dialectic of Hegel and the absurd existentialism of Heidegger. 100 years of modernism. The neomodernists also upheld the egological knowledge preached by their modernist predecessors, that knowledge which makes liberty and consciousness into being itself and which prepares the reign of blindness and absurdity. If no deseen human being exists, no world is there either. I am the being by whom there is SS gibt being. SS, I am the absolute source. My existence does not come from my antecedents, from my physical and social entourage. It goes toward them and sustains them. The fundamental existentialist principle is indeed the cogito, I think, therefore it is. Existence and liberty are interchangeable concepts. In their jargon, to exist is to surpass what you are. It is to invent yourself in perfect freedom. It is to create both your own essence and the world. In exegesis, egology comes in the form of an ongoing revelation, ever progressing at the whim of readers and their rereadings. A creative dynamism arises in the reader who understands the text when he begins to understand himself confronted with the text. Thus, what the text signifies no longer coincides with what the author meant to say. Everything is left to private judgment in readings ever more fulfilling in the spirit, to the detriment of the defined and immutable revelation. Finally, egology seems to have attained its paroxysm in Rahner. For him, if spirit is to be defined as the full possession of oneself and of one's creative power over oneself, then it is perfectly defined as liberty and will. Every knowledge of another by man is a mode of his self-knowledge, of his subjectivity. Now this holds also for man's knowledge of God. Finally, existentialism reduces being to pure duration, to revolutionism, creator of worlds and destinies at the whim of the most diverse facts of consciousness. For Sartre, being is one with the event and the situation. It is duration for Bergson. For Heidegger, it is time. As with Hegel, being is interchangeable with nothingness, for being exists, but it vanishes into the event, since, ultimately, it is not. Becoming is being. All is flux. This is the dawn of the most enormous transformation of the earth, time, and history. We are in the night. We await the day. The advocates of the new theology follow the same current when, with Blondel, they define the truth as the mind's correspondence with infinitely variable and progressive life. And since truth is life and tradition should transmit the May Kai Heidegger, being and time, p417, German reference, p.365, in Fauquier, L'existentialisme, p.7, Rahner, Hearers of the Word, p.183. Heidegger, Questi, quella métaphysique, in Courrier de Rome, Église contre Église, p.239. Heidegger, in Molnar, Le Dieu et mon nom, p.w04. Assessment of Neomodernism Truth, de Lubac concludes at the existence of a living tradition. According to him, then, the ulterior beliefs of the Church need not necessarily be logically bound to what she has always explicitly believed from the earliest centuries. Living tradition bobs along like a cork through the stream of evolving dogma. What a pleasant euphemism for the old heresy of dogmatic historicism. As for Rahner, his evolutionism is generously tainted with Teilhardian pantheism. Like Teilhard de Chardin, his starting point is a world in constant evolution, which becomes man since matter becomes spirit, while spirit little by little becomes God. The discontinuity and essential difference between matter, life, consciousness, and spirit by no means excludes evolution if it is true that there is becoming ... When we say against pantheism that God and the world are different, this statement is radically misunderstood if it is interpreted in a dualistic way. The difference between God and the world is of such a nature that God establishes and is the difference of the world from himself. 3. The innovations of neomodernism. In contrast with Catholic modernism, neomodernism exercised an enormous influence on the life of the Church, thanks in particular to the controversy surrounding Teilhard de Chardin. He stood forth as a scientist and a priest and a Jesuit to boot who denied creation, and explained all dogma in function of the biological evolution of matter on the Darwinian model. The popularity of his system was also due to the astuteness of its protagonists in covering their tracks and subtly propagating the same modernist poison under the label of the Fathers of the Church and Saint Sain. Thomas Aquinas. Furthermore, existentialism, the philosophy of the day for all its failings, at least had the merit of doing away with an excessive idealism. It offers a much less artificial and hence more human conception of the world, although it overcorrected and tumbled into absurdity and irrationality. However, the progress made by the new doctrines was not simply quantitative but above all qualitative. The great difference of neomodernism from modernism is in the clarity of its principles, which are pushed to the limit of their conclusions. Comparing neomodernism to the preceding eras of Protestant and Catholic modernism is like looking at a masterwork in broad daylight after having seen only the preliminary sketch, Fay, p. 216. In Ferraro, El naufragio del progresismo, p. 47. Rahner, Foundations of Christian Faith, p. 62. 100 Years of Modernism in the Dark. Protestantism was bold in its ideas, and modernism perfectly espoused its principles, but these doctrines had neither the cohesion nor the structure apparent in the system which developed between the wars. Above all, these forerunners did not state their driving principles clearly and openly. We have already seen in what these principles consist: the cogito volo of the existentialists, who basically deny the essences of things, since being precedes essence, and who posit an absurd creative liberty as their ultimate principle, the creative present moment. Theirs is also the dialectic invented by Hegel, according to which the infinite pours itself into the finite to become conscious infinitude. Thus, through the diversity of disciplines, a common element predominates, which is in contrast with the preceding modernist generations. The Protestants rallied around a critique which was radically ignorantist. The modernists were primarily attached to their notion of a fundamentally revolutionist, vital development. The neo-modernists, finally, in every domain emphasized the individual consciousness as the sole origin of knowledge. Theirs is a fundamentally egological knowledge, the profound and obscure introspection of the self considered as the alpha and the omega of all that is and moves. It is knowledge walled into itself and closed off from other beings. It is the most complete egology which quite naturally flows straight into narcissism and egolatry, the adoration of oneself. Of all three aspects, this one is the most diametrically opposed to realism, open to being. Ignorantism is simply negative and cannot constitute the foundation of an anti-culture. The revolutionist aspect is more fruitful, but itself exists only because it is founded on the egological consciousness in constant evolution. This is why the product of the Hegel-Heidegger-Rahner trio is the last word in neo-modernism. Its clarity leaves a great deal to be desired, but its loyalty to the principles is impeccable. In fact, the last 40 years of intellectual labor in the post-Vatican II Church have only been a thinly disguised rehashing of Rahner's theology. Yet, paradoxically, a great openness of mind toward every system of thought has grafted itself onto the negative aspect of man closed in on himself, forging his own truth. The most contradictory inventions are welcomed with equal respect. Each one is a little planet in orbit around itself with no concern to maintain contact with any common external center of gravity. Heidegger's goal was to create a symbiosis between the consciousness and its object in order to step beyond the opposition between dogmatic realism and subjective idealism. Beneath the mighty oak of patristic spiritual exegesis, there is a little branch for everyone, for biblical dogmatism just as much as for uncompromising critique. The pantheon of the Universal Synarchic Church offers a shrine to all the gods, even to Jesus Christ. Every individual, without distinction of creed or assessment of neo-modernism litmus test for revelation, can find refuge in the religion of man for man, since all are anonymous Christians. Never had modernism succeeded in offering a synthesis at once so logical in its fundamental principles and yet so comfortable for all. 4. Evolution or revolution in Christian culture? Neo-modernism is, in effect, a revival of modernism, be it Catholic or Protestant, which is what justifies their common appellation. Here again, it should not be difficult for us to reveal the radical incompatibility of these same principles upholding the entire edifice of the new heresy. They yield a definition of truth which destroys reason, opens the way to contradiction, and prepares a vision of revolutionary ecumenism. Existentialists destroy reason by denying that things in themselves have a certain nature, and by claiming that knowing means informing, or rather deforming, the object, whereas the contrary is the case. Sartre openly acknowledged his debt to Kant. Modern thought has realized considerable progress by reducing the existent to the series of appearances which manifest it. The being of an existent is exactly what it appears. Our theory of the phenomenon has replaced the reality of the thing by the objectivity of the phenomenon. For Heidegger, the human consciousness is what transforms brute things to give them a sense. Thus, the faculty most proper to man is liberty, understood as a spontaneous, irrational instinct, absurd beyond all reasoning. This position is not only agnostic, it is absurd. How can such a theory of the absurd even claim the title of a philosophy? But Rahner advocated no other. The intellect and the known and the knowing are the same. 13. Being in itself is being known. 14. He known is always the being of the knower. 14. Knowing is the subjectivity of being itself. 14. His problem does not consist in finding the bridge between mind and reality, but in distinguishing the knowing subject from the object known. Our philosopher brings egology full circle with his cogito volo. For the existentialists, truth is defined as a blind, absurd whim of the will. What are the characteristics of such a truth? Since there is no essence, beings are deprived of identity or permanence. They have no depth allowing them to rise above the present moment and escape the perpetual flux of the world. The same applies to God. Being as imagined by Plato, Ibid, p.70. Ibid, p.69, 100 years of modernism Titi is obsolete. It is now recognized as becoming 1.7. De Lubac, in the realm of exegesis, admitted a plurality of meanings for any given expression in Scripture, which opens the door to double meaning. It goes hand in hand with the concept of living tradition and ever richer interpretations in the Spirit, all the more fruitful that the text is pregnant with the most divergent meanings. Rahner offered the global vision of an evolving truth according to which all things, from matter all the way up to God, are subject to the laws of change. The Hegelian absolute is the infinite, which becomes the finite even as the finite stretches beyond its limits to become absolute infinitude. The immutable changes in order to gain awareness of itself, and so reach perfection. One can wonder if Rahner admitted even the possibility of eternal, immutable truth. The unity of Rahner's ecumenism is universal and univocal. Since God is all-powerful and wills to save all men, He does, in fact, save all men. The simple awareness of God operates our salvation ipso facto. Every man is an anonymous Christian, even if he explicitly refuses all association with the visible hierarchical church. Outside the church, salvation. The kingdom of God on earth is humanity as a whole, such that all men are saved, and if hell exists, it is empty. The people of God is not the ghetto church. It is the greater church which subsists in the Catholic Church but is not reduced to her. This theory of universal salvation is paralyzing to the very notion of missionary effort, henceforth superfluous. What is the use of crossing the seas and shedding your blood if it is only to render explicit something all men already possess, the assurance of salvation? Such is Conger's reasoning when he argues that no one can justify the missions by alleging a need to save souls. Neomodernism, founded on egological knowledge, fruit of Luther's private judgment, as taken up by the Protestants under the sign of pure critique and by the Catholic modernists in the name of vital development, is the dissolution of all thought. It remains a system of thought which makes everything revolve around the human consciousness, disdaining being and historical facts, alleging that the consciousness alone is the source of being and truth, and the source of revelation and divinity in the depths of man. It remains the same, ignorantist, egological, and revolutionist system of thought, which obliterates the three pillars upholding Christian culture: being, Jesus Christ, and God. It is that intellectual current which adopts a philosophy without being and a revelation without an historical Christ to conclude in a theology without God. Modernism in this, its ultimate phase, is historically the most perfect philosophical and religious nirvana paradise that has ever been invented by non-Bud 17. In Molnar, Le Dieu Immanent, p. 204. Assessment of Neomodernism Dists. Cardinal Siri felt compelled by this evidence to publish the following severe judgment of Rahner's philosophy as a whole. That is where the doctrines freely professed and taught lead to, which alter the objectivity of revealed teaching and which want to wrench the supreme secrets of God regarding the creation, grace, and salvation by the force of subjective intellection. And on this subject, here is a proposition of the same Karl Rahner, which illustrates the importance of this erroneous way of approaching the question of grace and the supernatural. That is where one has gotten in, starting from a concept concerning as great a mystery as the mystery of the supernatural, artificially presented as being part of the doctrine of the Church. All questions have been touched upon. Little by little, all principles, all criteria, and all the foundations of the faith have been questioned, and they crumble. 5. The authorities' reaction to neomodernism. It is enlightening and reassuring to see that, faced with the same evil of modernism, the two popes Pius XII in the footsteps of Saint Celeste, Pius X declared war to the death on the same principles and the same doctrine. The second modernist crisis was an opportunity to reaffirm the fundamental principles of Christianity and to show that they are radically undermined by modernist principles. Pope Pius XII systematically lambasted the philosophical, exegetical, and theological positions maintained by the partisans of error, opposing to them the constant and unchanging teaching of the Church as upheld by St. Pius X, founded on the same realist philosophy and the same historical revelation. Thus, Pius XII did not cede an inch to the theory of mythical gospels or of a mythical Genesis, all the while leaving open those questions not yet resolved. There can be no dialogue with a philosophy which prides itself on its ignorantism and its absurdity. There can be nothing worth preserving in a theology which draws all dogma out of human consciousness. Disciplinary measures were taken to counter the influence of the infiltrators, especially since the Pope considered that the situation was threatening the very survival of the Church. Doubtless, with hindsight, we can regret that the measures were not as severe as those taken by St. Pius X, and yet, had not churchmen already been infected by a spirit of insubordination toward Rome, we might also judge that the irrational foundations of neomodernism were not sufficiently exposed, as Rahner, for one, had not yet formulated his brilliant synthesis. Like his predecessor, Pius XII did not take a defensive position or try to dialogue with the evil because, when a cancer is eating away at the very foundation of the Church of Christ, there is no time for compromise or negotiation. No attempt at 100 years of modernism, ecumenism with the modernist clan, no kid gloves with the traitor lurking in the square. His encyclical Humani Generis truly resounds as a second syllabus of the same errors condemned a second time for the same reasons and with the same arguments. Divine Providence willed to confirm that modernism, even if advocated at the highest level of the Church, as would soon be the case, is a cancerous heresy doubly denounced, abhorred, and condemned for all time by the one Church of Jesus Christ, the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church. Part V. Modernism. Triumphant Humani Generis appeared in 1950. The year 1965 marked the closing of the Second Vatican Council, which cast doubt on the fundamental points reaffirmed by the Pope Pacelli. Never before had a dogmatic encyclical been so quickly and so completely disavowed by the very men who had fallen under its condemnation. How is it possible that the new theology, censured so solemnly and so definitively by Pius XII, in perfect accord with Pius X's Pascendi, should have become the official theology of Vatican II and the post-conciliar Church? Here we enter upon the history of Vatican II and the conciliar Church, so baptized by the neomodernists in power. For Vatican II indeed represents a break with the Catholic Church by the avowal of her leaders themselves. The post-conciliar popes, Paul VI and John Paul II, rarely if ever cite the traditional magisterium. For them, the Church began in 1962, the date of a new spiritual springtime. Yet it was a springtime that flooded the Church with winter fog. Paul VI spoke of uncertainty, of skepticism, and of the smoke of Satan entering the Church. John Paul II occasionally stepped out of his habitual optimism and ceded before the evidence of a crisis in the Church. Cardinal Ratzinger, John Paul II's alter ego, has described in great detail the gaping wounds of each of the 4 Christian continents: Melanie of La Salette and Senior, Lucy of Fatima, the 2 seers, united in predicting the spiritual disorientation, the loss of the dogma of the faith, the eclipse of the Church, and the nefarious role of those appointed as shepherds of the flock. In itself, such a crisis is nothing new. The novelty lies in its having appeared so suddenly and with an unprecedented intensity. What is new is that the burial of Catholic tradition in its entirety was performed with official pomp and ceremony, with incense and pontifical high mass. Disguised as an apotheosis, Vatican II demolished piece by piece the scaffolding constructed by our Lord, and what remained standing would be bulldozed during the subsequent pontificates. An intention to remain faithful to 2 councils, Vatican I and Vatican II, which differ so clearly the one from the other, is quite simply untenable. The council presented Catholics with a problem so unusual that they only managed to sidestep it by a certain blindness and surrender of the reason. Daniel Olivier, Les Deux Visages du Prêtre, Paris, Fayard, 1971, p. Dyson 6. 100 Years of Modernism. What is newest of all is the mode of operation. Satan's masterstroke was to destroy the Church in the name of obedience, the ultimate Catholic virtue. By following the directives of the Roman authorities undermining the faith and the institutions, all bishops, priests, and faithful, knowingly or otherwise, collaborated in the loss of the truth and of the faith. As though the conscience could be excused for obeying the perverse orders of the superiors, as though destroying the Church and denying the faith could become meritorious and virtuous, as though it were better to be mistaken with the Pope than to be right against him. By the subterfuge of blind obedience, the authorities in service of evil conducted a revolution in tiara and cope under the aegis of ecumenism. In the present post-conciliar period, we may well ask how many of the faithful still hold to the faith of their baptism. Paul VI perhaps never spoke so true as when he foresaw a period in the not-so-distant future when the Church would be persecuted and reduced to a remnant, the silent Church. The structure of the following chapters will differ from that of the previous studies. Here we must treat of history still in living memory and not of the abstract dogmas of a bygone age. Accordingly, in strict justice, we should have balanced our criticism of the pontificates under study by throwing into relief their positive aspects as well. But we are constrained by a lack of space to go directly to the essential, just as the doctor, called to a patient's bedside, does not begin listing the healthy organs, but promptly applies the scalpel to the malignancy. Thus, our literary scalpel must confine itself to the negative aspects. A council or a pontificate is distinct, and can be defined not by what it preserves, but by what it adds or cuts away, in other words, by its guiding theme. The theme stands out boldly when we begin to study the conciliar Church, to describe the triumph of modernism over Saint. Peter's, we first must spend a certain time looking at the history and the teaching of Vatican Council II. We will then be in a position to appreciate the subsequent pontificates of Paul VI and of John Paul II, with an interlude devoted to Cardinal Ratzinger and the scriptural question.